Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's kind of unusual being here in the afternoon, isn't it? Yes, I feel like I should say good morning. I suppose I could do that too. Okay, good morning. Good morning, good afternoon. Now we've got it covered. But I am so glad to have all of you join us because this is going to be an outstanding presentation. And we are so pleased to have with us Allison and Chaplain Ron from Minnesota Hospice. And they have been just such valued, highly valued colleagues who have helped us as staff, and I just anticipate lots of good information and very helpful information that is coming not only from expertise right here, but coming from the heart. And so that is why we were so eager to extend the invitation today. So, Fountains friends, I am going to ask you, we're sticking with Fountains tradition, would you help me in just welcoming our friends Allison and Chaplain Ron?
Let's see if I can figure this out here. Is there a fun way of getting this out? Just pull? I might end up throwing it, Mary. But there we go. Hello and welcome. My name is Allison Oja, and I'm the Director of Community Support and Education with Minnesota Hospice. And like Mary, I would like to thank all of you for coming today. And we hope you find something of comfort and value today as Ron and I talk a little bit about understanding grief, its experience, coping, and hoping. And with that, actually, I can't look at notes and hold this at the same time, I'm discovering.
I couldn't either.
You're right. So, with that being said, today, we're hoping that by the end of this, you will be able to understand and describe uncomplicated, anticipatory, and ambiguous grief, be able to describe the physical, emotional, and spiritual experiences of grief, identify some inhibitors to healthy grieving and when it might be time to seek out help, as well as identify some coping strategies that might be able to assist you in grieving in a healthy way.
Do we have a final exam or?
No final
Oh,
exam
no final
today.
exam.
I think we're going to get the exam.
Okay. Let's introduce our hospice team.
Oh, yes. You go.
Okay, we have Jill Kestner, who is, did you say a float nurse here? Okay. And we have Tamara Langley, social worker.
You guys have to stand at least.
And we have Alyssa, the case manager for the Fountains. And Josie's not here, but she's the aide that's normally here. And then I am the chaplain with this team, and well, some have called us a dream team, but we kind of like that. So anyway, we'll go with that.
And I'm sure that you all see our team here every day. So please feel free to stop by and talk to them as well. We're going to go to the second page, and we're going to talk about, let's just give a straight up definition of what is grief. Grief is a normal, universal reaction to losing someone or something important to us. And it's a unique response. All of us respond, all of us have grief.
And it's natural.
And it's natural.
It's unnatural not to grieve.
Not to grieve.
It's natural to grieve.
And so grief is unique to each individual, and every person grieves in their own time and in their own way. And I just want to start this out. I know we use the word normal twice already in like less than 2 minutes, but I want to make sure that everybody understands that there is no such thing as normal or a typical response to grief. Every person copes with it in their own way, feels it in their own way. So it's unavoidable, it can't be ignored, and the only way through is And the only way to deal with it is through. And there is no right or wrong way to grieve. I know some people, when I talk with them, sometimes I got a call from a woman a couple of weeks ago, and she said, I don't think I'm grieving right. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And she started talking about the stages. And what we had to have a talk about is that not everybody grieves like that. And people grieve differently. And
And
that's
think they need to in
okay.
a certain order, don't they, sometimes?
Yep, and that's okay. And there is no order for this. It's in your own time and way. The other thing I'd like to point out is grief is not something that's abnormal. It's not unhealthy or morbid or something to be cured or gotten over. This is not depression, and it's not a mental illness. Grief is something that every human being that loves someone or something experiences at some point in their life. We're going to go to the next page about many types of losses. Now, loss is not just associated with the death of somebody or somebody we're close to. There are many, many different types of losses in grief. There are losses of relationships, jobs, homes, possessions, status, the loss of dreams and independence. But all of those things are losses that we grieve. And can you guys think of any other types of losses that people experience? Oh, come on, my team knows. Pets. Pets are a big one.
Oh, yeah.
That's a huge loss. She said pets. Yes. Is that better? Okay. I didn't want to overwhelm you guys with, okay. Yes, pets, vision and hearing, health. Those are all significant losses that we grieve and that we need to acknowledge as grief.
Things we were able to do that we no longer are able to do. There's certainly grief around that.
If you flip to the next page, there's this beautiful picture, but as we were mentioning a little bit earlier, there is not a one-size-fits-all. There are many, many different types of grief. But the types of grief that we're going to focus on today, if you go to the next page, we're going to focus on 3 specific types of grief. We're going to talk about ambiguous grief, anticipatory grief, and uncomplicated grief. If you flip to the next page, you'll find ambiguous grief at the top. And ambiguous grief is a loss that may or may not involve death, but it involves the loss of a person or something that might be physically absent but psychologically present, such as the disappearance of a family member or adoption when somebody gives up a child. Another form of ambiguous grief is when somebody is physically present but psychologically absent. And that's something that we see with dementia and traumatic brain injury. And these types of losses can make closure difficult because we deal a lot with the physically present but psychologically absent. And that can be really difficult because we start grieving long before that person physically dies. And that can be a really good thing, but it can also complicate things as well. Do you want
Oh, anticipatory grief. The distress people feel days, months, or even years prior to the death of a loved one or some other meaningful loss. We see this in hospice with patients where they have, an illness that cannot be cured, and the family and even the patient is dealing with facing death or facing the changes or what it's going to be like when they're gone. What will I do? How will this be? And so it's a very real kind of thing.
It's kind of grieving forward.
Yeah.
You're grieving in advance. But that can be a really good thing because it allows us to start processing that grief earlier. And we grieve changes that we know are coming, changes and losses that we know are coming.
One other thing I would say about anticipatory grief, sometimes when you've had somebody that you cared for that's been ill a long time and you've taken care of them, you've taken good care of them, or other people have been involved in their care, so you feel like, okay, when they're gone, I've already done my grieving. Well, you've certainly done some grieving, but there's more grieving to come following that. So we'll talk a little more about that.
And with anticipatory grief, I have worked with people who didn't know this was a thing. They knew that they were grieving, but they didn't know there was a name for it. And sometimes having a name for something and being able to put a label on that allows you to help process your grief as you're moving through it. And if you go to the next page, people experience a really wide variety of feelings during anticipatory grief. You might feel anger or irritability, anxiety about what's coming. You might feel a little bit of denial. No, this isn't really happening. Or the desire to withdraw from other people because you don't want to share what's happening or that you're grieving. You might feel desperation, dread for what's coming, even guilt. Another thing that's very common with anticipatory grief is that there is an intense preoccupation with the impending loss, with the person that we're going to lose. And that can really focus where somebody and a caregiver becomes very, very focused on that individual person. And that can be okay, but it's important to understand that there is still life going on.
Yeah, I know, like with our social workers and all of us as a team, certainly when people want to talk openly about their fear of not being ready when somebody's going to die, but our patients, we sometimes have patients for a long, long time. But what I'm trying to say is that, I think I've forgotten what I'm trying to say, but I'm going to go ahead here. Is that, what was I saying?
You were talking about having people work with us on services for a very long time.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. She's called me back. I'm back here. But we deal with that, but we also put the focus on we want these people to live to the fullest, and we want the quality to do the best it can and to create the best memories that we can during that process. I don't think I'd ever recall that, so thank you.
The other thing that we want to talk about is grief styles. Sometimes people think, as we mentioned earlier, that people aren't grieving, they feel they aren't grieving correctly. Or oftentimes you might have two family members who grieve very differently, and one feels like the other isn't grieving. And if you go to the next page, grief is really on a spectrum, and how we deal with grief is on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have intuitive grievers, and those are people who express their feelings. They may cry, they want to talk about what they're feeling and what they're going through. And they express grief as waves of feeling. Because grief can hit you in waves, and it can hit you at any time. Grief never goes away.
The waves keep coming. The intensity of the waves decrease, hopefully, with time and when you give grief the attention you need to.
But it's always something you carry with you. If you love somebody, that's always going to be something that you carry with you. But with intuitive grievers, they're very much more open about their loss and their grief. On the very opposite end of that spectrum, do you know anybody who lost a loved one who didn't cry about it, but they did something? They might have started a fundraiser for a certain, breast cancer or something like that. Those are instrumental grievers. They are people who grieve by doing. They're still grieving and it's internal and they might not talk about it or express it emotionally, but they are still grieving. And that can really cause some conflict between family members when you have people that grieve differently. And it's really important to understand that we're all on the spectrum. I tend to be a much more intuitive griever. When I'm sad, you know it, and I'm gonna talk about it. My aunt, on the other hand, when her father died, she grabbed a clipboard, she had her pen, and she had her list of what's going on and what we're gonna do next and how we're gonna deal with this. That is how she works through her grief, is by doing. And understanding that people have those different styles can be a really useful thing in grieving together. Now, let's talk a little bit about the experience of grief. I'm on the next page. Grief is not experienced in just one way. Grief is experienced globally. It's experienced physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I'm flipping again. The physical experience of grief. When somebody is grieving, you can feel your grief physically. It might present as aches or pains. It's not uncommon for people who have lost a loved one to fall ill themselves shortly after the loss. They may sleep too much. They may not sleep at all because they can't turn their brain off. You might notice changes in appetite, weight gain, weight loss, fatigue, headaches, dizziness. Grief is felt physically in many, many ways.
I was noting how often fatigue is a part of all of these, and grief takes a lot of energy. And this is kind of a blunt way to say it, but grief sucks. It sucks energy out of you. And people say, I don't know why I can't get anything done. I just don't have the energy. I just am content just to sit here. And some of that is very normal part of grieving. And there's a need for a person to rest and take care of themselves and not feel guilty about that.
And if you flip to the next page, emotional. We all think of grief as a very emotional response. And initially, if you've lost somebody, oftentimes people are just shocked or they're numb and they're concerned, I'm not feeling anything right now. That's a very typical response after just losing somebody.
And that can be in some ways, that can be helpful because it's so overwhelming. You're just not able to feel all that you feel, and to be a little have shock and some numbness is sometimes, for a period, is helpful.
But after that shock and numbness, it gives way to sadness and sometimes some despondency or loss of hope, anger at the person who they've lost, fear. We already mentioned fatigue, brain fog. I've talked with many people who say, I cannot hold a thought in my head. I have the attention span of a gnat. That is very normal. You're not losing it. It's very, very common response to loss. Your brain is doing a lot of work, and you have a lot on your mind, and you're preoccupied. So that brain fog that can settle in, trust me, it does go away. It does settle out. But it can be a really disconcerting experience. The other thing you might feel is relief. And some people worry about that. You know, I just lost my dad, and I'm horribly sad, but I'm also relieved. And that's also a common response. And it is okay to be sad and relieved at the same time. You can hold both of those feelings in the same space.
And when things go on for so long, and it's so difficult and so intense, and you get so weary, there can be a sense of relief and a sense of release. And, you know, that I think is very, very normal.
As is the feeling of loneliness. You know, everybody comes and supports you immediately after a loss. But a couple weeks in, 5, 6 weeks, people have moved on, and you're going, how can you move on? Nothing in my world is the same. I don't understand how people can move on. And you experience sometimes some really profound loneliness. And that is also a part of coping through your grief response. Do you have anything to add? If you go to the next page, we're going to talk a little bit about what impacts grief. There are many, many things that impact our grief. Culture. In some cultures, it might be culturally appropriate to grieve in a certain way. What your relationship is to that person. Is it a spouse? Is it a sibling? Is it a parent? And our grief is impacted by the type of relationship we have with somebody. We might have feelings of guilt and the dynamics of the relationship. Were you really close to this person that you lost? Or was there a complicated relationship, let's put it that way, where maybe there might have been some really positive things about this person, but there might have been some abuse or some other things that made the relationship more complicated. And that can really impact how you grieve.
I can remember years ago with a hospice patient, and they wanted me to do the memorial service. And the wife said, I won't use her language, but she said, if you make him sound too good, I'm going to get up and walk out. So I've learned sometimes in families to say, what kind of relationship do you have? You know, we're in and out. Your mother seems like, you know, really nice person. I had one daughter say, do not make my mother out the mother of the year. So, I mean, that does complicate grief, and it's good to be honest about that, I think. And
it is.
It's healthy grieving.
Another thing that can really impact your grief is unresolved grief. Sometimes we work with families who have lost so many people, particularly with the pandemic, where they've lost one person after another person in a very short amount of time, where just working through that grief, they're working through and they're hit with just another loss. And that just compounds and adds to your grief and to how you cope with that.
And I've heard people say that I just had so many things to do. I was just so busy. I had so many responsibilities that the grief was just postponed or delayed or put off. And they felt the need to get back into that and do the work they needed to do.
And there's also some inhibitors to healthy grieving. The expectations of others. your own expectations of how you should grieve. Just as Chaplain Ron mentioned, avoidance, where people just will not deal with the fact of their loss.
I'm full of stories today.
Oh, go for it.
But, you know, in terms of others' expectations, I had I think at that time was a parishioner, and she lost her mother, and she was telling me the night before the funeral that she said, my son said, Mother, you just have got to buck up and pull it together and get over this. And she said, well, can you give me till after the funeral? That just goes to show the unrealistic expectations people have. And she was wise enough to say, that is not going to happen, and that's not good for that to happen.
Another thing that can really inhibit healthy grieving is alcohol or substance abuse. Sometimes when people are really hurting and they are really grieving, they look to alcohol or drugs to kind of numb that pain. And an occasional drink is one thing. It's another thing if that is used as a crutch for avoiding dealing with the grief.
Because when the numb wears off, it's still there.
It is. And worrying about grieving correctly. This all yours?
Okay. And I like this one. It says, if any of these signs continue for an extended period of time, it may be time to seek professional help. I think it's when they do last for extended time, and when you are having trouble functioning, and it's always there front and center, and you can't seem to get around it. You can't seem to get through to moving into a healing direction.
Or you're isolating. You're not interacting with others. You're avoiding working with others or seeing others. Or sometimes people just stop dealing with life, even poor hygiene, eating or sleeping routines just gone. That feeling of being overwhelmed for a very long time. Typically, we don't start really getting concerned about that until about the 6, 7, 8 month mark. And if some of this is still so front and center, then it might be time to really sit down and talk with somebody.
Okay, oops. The bring it on home, I told Allison I thought about this in terms of, I know all of you, well, I assume all of you have had grief and may be grieving right at this moment. And, you've had your own experience, and I hope you've heard some things that resonate and that will be helpful. I found something, and I don't know who wrote this, called The Perfect Griever. Now, if you were the perfect griever, you would cry just the right amount. You'd talk about the person just the right amount. You would take excellent care of yourself. You would do everything perfectly. Well,
There's no such thing.
okay, there's not. And the word I have for you is, we need to accept our humanity and know that grief is a vulnerable time. And to feel what we feel, and to say to ourselves and give ourselves permission that we're not perfect and that we're not going to do it in a perfect way. And grief is not a time to be hard on yourself. It's not a time to give yourself problems and just, have shame or whatever. That is not helpful. My hope is, and I know Allison's hope in what we've shared, is that you would grieve in a way that you need to. That will be a healthy way of grieving for you.
And that you're gentle with yourself. It's really important that you give yourself some grace. And and acknowledge that vulnerability and that it's okay to feel this way and okay to be right where you're at.
A couple more stories. I'm in an exercise group. You may not think it's doing much good, but I'm trying. And there's a lady there that, we're new friends, but she knows what I do. So she shared with me that she was going to have breakfast with a friend of hers whose husband died 2 weeks ago. He had stomach cancer, and I think it was about a 2-year-long illness, very, very challenging. So that was on Friday, and so on Monday, I asked her, I said, well, how did your visit go with your friend? She said, oh, just wonderful. She said, God is so good. And I said, yes, God is so good. Okay. She said, God is so good, and she seemed to be really doing well. And what I said to the lady is, she's having some relief. She's having relief from a long, long illness and a very difficult time. But the grief is not over, and she realized that. I said, it's going to come in waves. There's things she's going to need to do. Your next visit may be very, very different. I have another friend who lost his wife, and when I talk to him, I'll say, well, how did you do? And he'd say, well, on a scale to 1 to 10, I'm a 12. I did great. I'm doing great. I think after the holidays, he said he did better during the holidays than he expected to do. I talked to him just recently, and he said, he said, of course, I'm getting close to the anniversary. Then after that, so I just said to him, grief comes in waves. You're always going to have those waves come. Now they're more intense than you want them to be. But don't be hard on yourself, and don't deny it, don't neglect it, face it, and it's good that you talk about. I think there were freedoms of grieving I wanted to share with you. The freedom to feel numbness, we talked about that. Am I still doing okay at the microphone? Okay. The freedom, like we've shared, to know your grief is unique. The freedom to know that you're going to feel so many emotions. The freedom to allow physical, emotional limits, and fatigue, like we've mentioned. Fatigue is a part of all of it, and the need for rest and the need for self-care. And the freedom to develop good support. Sometimes it's hard to find people, even in your family, that'll really listen to you. A lot of times they want to give you advice. They want to tell you how long you should grieve or what you should do. But if you can find someone that will listen to you and be on the journey with you and let you talk and, will really listen to what you say. And then the last thing is we're going to deal with the spiritual experience of grief, the loss of hope, the anger at God, renewed hope, increased faith, and spiritual growth. And I hope I cover those in somewhat of what I'm going to do now. I want to say to you that no matter how strong your faith is, or how much you love God, how deep your love is for God, or the feeling that if you have enough faith, that you just would not grieve. You're happy for them. And in my faith, I am happy. And I have a sense of peace for my loved ones. From Romans 8, that not even death has separated them from the love of God. But that does not take away my grief. It does not take it away, because I have to adjust to the fact that they're not there. And we can feel frustrated and angry with God. Why does this have to happen? I look at other people, they're not going through this. Why do I have to do this? And so we feel some distance from God, maybe. But I say to you, at the very time you feel distant from God, I feel God is as close, a loving God is close as the next breath, to be there with you and for you. It's important to name the loss, to be honest and to share your feelings, and to stop and reflect and recognize, name the loss. You've heard that before, the hurt and pain. And then the time for reflection. And it hurts sometimes. It hurts a lot of times to stop and reflect. But it's a very important part of healing. And, culture says run away from it, get away from it. And then you have guilt. If I'd only been there, or if things had been different, or if I'd have gotten a different doctor, or some of the last things that I said, I wish I hadn't said, or I kind of wish my loved one could have been a little different, during that last hours and time. And so, but all of that is healthy to think through and even pray through if prayer is what you do. Allison shared a book with me that showed a different strategy than I had seen before. It talks about having a drawer or a place with pictures and with memories and with things about your loved one, and to pull that out and maybe set the timer, so you won't go too long with it. That's just a way to, it's down there, and it's a way to bring it up and to deal with it. And rituals, sharing a meal with a friend or lighting a candle. Some people write letters to their loved ones. They express how they feel. They might express regrets. They might, all kinds of things. And I've heard people say that can be helpful. Some people journal and write their feelings. So, with all of this, how do we move forward? And how, I think, the goal is to move toward healing, right? Well, you live with it, and you try to reconcile yourself to it. People say, I will just want to return to life as it was, to that normal. But you are changed because of the grief. There's no perfect state of recovery, and there's always going to be pangs of guilt and waves of feeling. And
Sorry, go ahead.
oh, okay. I thought maybe we were tired.
I was going to answer.
Okay. So what is the ultimate goal? I don't know. But I think maybe to integrate that loss, to deal with it, to a lot of these things have been suggested. And then I think the hope is that you feel a new sense of energy once you go through some of this. You have the capacity to get back into life. The grief, like we said, is just not always front and center and in your face. So those of you that have the Christian faith, that believe there's nothing in this world, not even death, that can separate us from the love of God, if you believe that's for your loved one, know that love is for you. And try to be open to that as a source of healing. That there's nothing that separates you from that love. I find peace that my loved one is in a place of no suffering and pain. and there's eternal love. That brings me a lot of peace. But I still grieve like everything. And the scripture says, grieve not. Doesn't stop there. It says, grieve not as those who do not have hope. Grieve, but try to do the kinds of things in your faith that will give a hope that comforts and reassures you and ultimately brings healing.
And life will never be exactly the same. What happens is as you're moving through grief, you discover a new normal. It might not be the normal that you planned for or that you dreamt about, but you do redefine that relationship with your loved one. That relationship, just because they passed away, does not mean that that relationship ended. It means that you're redefining your relationship with that loved one who is no longer here with you physically, and you are discovering a new normal. And it can be a really hard thing to accept that it will never go back to exactly the way it was. But there are ways to find joy in that new normal and to find happiness in that new normal.
Yeah, that's great. Is there any response that any of you have? We have a little bit of time.
Any questions?
How do you folks go through this day by day, week by week?
You go through it 1 minute at a time, and there is no easy way through.
But you do go by it day by day, and it's good if you are recognizing that and not trying to deny it, not trying to run away from it. For some people, that day by day is really intense, and I don't know if it is right now for you, but the hope is that it would become less intense and not so painful and not so overwhelming, I guess is what I would say.
Yes.
Does it become less intense as you try to do your normal activities, or should you give yourself time away from normal activities just to take care of yourself, or is there a balance with it?
I think there's really a balance in that. I think it's much more about what feeds you at the moment. If you feel like that normal activity will give you some surcease, some peace for even just a few minutes, or some form of enjoyment or happiness, then I would say go ahead and pursue that. If it's something you're dreading and you don't feel like that will serve you, then you need to take care of yourself. And you need to take that time for yourself. And I think that that's different for every person.
I agree wholeheartedly. But I do think there are times, especially early on, if a person just doesn't feel like, they have the energy or that it would be helpful, that they shouldn't necessarily be pushed. It should be on their own initiative and their own decision that they feel good about. Yeah, I wanted to repeat that for him. She said here at the Fountains, they've had so many deaths, like 7 or 8 or, yeah, I know. And, but yeah, and you see the families and you have your own grief. You have your own grief and you're trying, and we have that in hospice too. But that's, very real. And I really do think there are times for those when you have a lot of grief going on around you that there's a need for us to find some ways to be re-energized or renewed, or, yeah, because it takes it out of you, for sure.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge your grief. And I think a lot of times people who are caregivers that might not be family, but like you said, people become your family. It's not blood, it's you have family that isn't blood. And that compounded grief with multiple losses, you need to acknowledge that you are grieving, that it's okay to grieve. And sometimes it can really help to talk about it with other caregivers who are also grieving. And to realize you're not alone in that grief.
Yes, absolutely.
Any other questions?
Hospice people, are there anything you wish we'd have said that we didn't say? Not that we're perfect, we know we're not.
Hold on, Jill, that might be easier.
So I will say, with my own personal grief and when I've lost loved ones, just speaking of what Cameron was talking about, it took me probably a good year before I really felt, I took it day by day, minute by minute, and it took me a year before I felt semi-normal, and it just, that I would explain it as a gaping wound. And then after a year, it started to become a scar, and then eventually, or it started to become a scab, and then eventually now it's a scar. It never goes away, it's always there, but it gets more bearable. So that's my personal experience.
That's been mine too, Jill. That's been mine too.
Yeah. Did you guys want to say anything else?
Thank you, Ms. Jill. Are there any other questions? I would really encourage those of you who are in the grieving process and who might be struggling, I would encourage you to find somebody to talk to, and as Chaplain Ron said, to listen. Sometimes it does help just to be able to, for lack of a better word, puke all that stuff out, to be able to let all of that out and not hold it inside. I know that's a horrible word for it, but it's apt. It's expressive, but it can really, really take its toll if you're holding all of that grief and all of that sadness inside. And I would encourage you to seek out a friend, seek out Chaplain Ron, seek out any of our team, Tamara, our social worker. We encourage you to lean on the support that's available. Don't think that you're alone or that you have to go through that alone.
Fountains, anything else you feel like we need to? I know, I'll tell you, we have worked together, and she is so good and
I need to
knowledgeable.
apologize. This was our first round through this
But
education, so we're a
there
little
is so
stilted.
much
It'll get better.
information, and we want to share helpful information. That's our goal, we want to. So, anything else I know there's a lot more that could be said.
Oh, I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours if you let me, but we're gonna wrap it up here.
With a prayer.
With a prayer.
And for those of you that pray, and I assume that's quite a lot of you here, find the prayer of faith, and let's pray that together, if you're comfortable doing that. We trust beyond the absence, there is presence, that beyond the pain, there can be healing, that beyond brokenness, there can be wholeness, that beyond anger, there can be peace, that beyond hurting may be forgiveness, that beyond silence, there may be the word, that beyond the word, there may be understanding, and through understanding, there may be love. Amen.
I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of your schedules to come and share with us today. And I really appreciate your being the first ones to run through this. And we will not be so stilted next time, I promise. Or I won't be. But it's been a while since I've gotten up in front of a lot of people. But I want to thank you, and I would encourage you to reach out to our team as you see them, and have a wonderful afternoon.
And it takes courage to come to things like this.
It does.
It takes courage. You know, we have these times of, what do we call that at hospice, where we do there 6 months,
Nights of Remembrance?
Night of Remembrance. You know, when I'm there greeting people, I think, oh, this is kind of hard. You know, we're just kind of stirring this up. But when I get in the right mind, and after that time, I think this is so good. This is so good because it encourages us we're still grieving, and it encourages us to take it out and deal with it. And those are the kinds of things that I hope and pray you can find to do. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.